to be here, and I'm so deeply, deeply grateful to the Charlottesville Albemarle Historical Society for extending the invitation to participate in what I view as an important, a timely, and a very necessary series, Fighting for Freedom, the Declaration of Independence and its Legacy. Over really the past 15 years, a significant amount of my time as a teacher, as a researcher, and also as a resident of Charlottesville has been thinking about the politics of history, the role of public history in understanding the long, protracted struggle for democracy. Since 2012, I've been involved in a multidisciplinary, multimedia project called Black Fire, which explores the history of student protest at the University of Virginia from the 1960s to the present. As a part of this project, I have collaborated with my colleague Kevin Everson on a series of short films that highlight the rich tradition of political protest at the University of Virginia and the vibrant intellectual and cultural institutions created by students, faculty, and community members. I also teach a large course called Black Fire, and I consider it a privilege and an honor to teach this course. It celebrates the efforts of students, faculty, and workers who over the past 60 years have sought to transform the University of Virginia, politically, socially, and intellectually. And in that course, we engage a series of questions. How has the University of Virginia transformed since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964? Who have been the principal advocates for civil rights at UVA? And how have their arguments changed over time? How does a focus on the University of Virginia enhance our understanding of American and African American history, the civil rights struggle, and the politics of race in the post-civil rights era? And then last question, how has the struggle for and the meaning of diversity changed over time? I heard that sigh in the audience. And this course also deals with class. It thinks about the University of Virginia as an employer and as a corporation. We discuss the experiences of workers, the living wage movement, debates around college affordability, and the role of the university in shaping the quality of life for thousands of people who call Charlottesville home. This history is grounded in the past, but it is also engaged with the present. So we look at more recent events like the brutal arrest of Martise Johnson on the corner, as well as the Unite the Right rallies of August 11th and 12th in 2017. And as you all might imagine, in the fall, we talked a lot about the resignation of Jim Ryan. And those were some very intense conversations that raised questions about the role of a public institution, Jefferson's vision, the meaning of equality, the meaning of justice, and also the meaning of reconciliation. And I must say, teaching this year was like no other. These were students who were there in the fall of 2022 during the November shooting. And these were also students who experienced the resignation of a president who was very much beloved. And like students and young people often do, they thought about this and they intellectualized this. And so in May, I got a lot of papers, a lot of theses that looked at what happened at the University of Virginia over the past year and a half and attempted to situate what happened within a larger history. We talk a lot about Thomas Jefferson. We talk a lot about the Declaration of Independence. And part of my work as an African-American historian involves engaging the complex meaning of democracy and also the complex legacy of the Declaration of Independence. And so today, in our limited time together, I want to consider how student activists from the 1960s through the present have turned to the Declaration of Independence as a model of the art of democratic writing, as an act of political protest, and as a project of new world making. And in the process, I'm going to also show you some pretty pictures. This is one of my favorite pictures from 1968. And one of the reasons that I like this picture is because it features a group of students from the 1960s who I think understood the art of democratic writing. They understood political protest, and they were also committed to creating a better world, what I would call new world making. Over the course of our conversation, I want to also highlight the tension between equality as a principle and equality as an outcome. So when preparing for today, I thought deeply about the ways in which the Declaration of Independence as a piece of writing that's brilliant has influenced the ways in which students engaged in political protest. This, for example, is a poster from May of 1970. On May the 4th, 1970, 4 co-eds at Kent State University, of course, were murdered. And we all know about Kent State. And in the aftermath of Kent State, there were rebellions and revolts and student protests across the nation. More than 400 college campuses, including the University of Virginia. At about 10 p.m. on May the 4th, about 1,500 students gathered on the lawn. And for the next 2 weeks, students engaged in protests. At the same time, the university remained open. But they raised questions about desegregation, co-education, the militarization of the university, police presence, integration, and student self-governance. And one of the things that you see in this particular poster is a reference to the Declaration of Independence. Charlottesville, the city that brought you the Declaration of Independence, now brings you a day of peace. So throughout the history of student protest at the University of Virginia, the more recent history, we see this reference to the Declaration of Independence. But we also see the ways in which the act of writing the Declaration of Independence, the process of writing the Declaration of Independence, influenced student activists. And when they engaged in the work of world making, they relied on the art of writing. And so in many ways, the history of student protest at the University of Virginia is also the history of documents. What I would call in some ways freedom documents. This is, of course, a picture of the late James Roebuck. In November of 1968, James Roebuck, as well as author Bud Ogle, and we're going to talk about him a little later, presented a series of demands to their student council colleagues. And those demands focused on increasing the African-American presence at the University of Virginia, hiring more African-American faculty and coaches. At this point, UVA had yet benched Jim Crow. addressing the relationship between the university and the local community, improving the condition of low-income workers, and implementing a Black Studies program. These demands continued in 1969. This is actually some footage. It cost me $2,500. This is footage from a protest in February of 1969. This is the protest known as Students Against UVA's Racist Atmosphere. And many of the demands that students made in 1968, they also articulated in 1969. Desegregation, demanding that Edgar Shannon desegregate the university, calling for a Black Studies program, calling for better wages and conditions for workers, calling for the end of photos as requirements for admission, imagining a new university. I wanted just to show you this as well because this is also a part of my project as a historian. I love the archives. And in 2012, 2011, I was fortunate to find this this reel-to-reel from 1969. Unfortunately, I don't have the audio. Oh. I know. Maybe I should keep looking harder, all right? And my good colleague, my former colleague, Michael Holt, was kind enough to give us some money to sort of to process this. Once again, I think it's important to also talk about local history. And in some ways, when you think about audio visuals in the 1960s, there's so much that we're still finding about this period. But this is a protest from 1969. And of course, during that protest, the students made a series of demands. A critical figure in this moment is Arthur Bud Ogle. And Arthur Bud Ogle was really close to James Roebuck. And he was a part of a group of students who wanted to create a better university. And he was central in 1968, central in 1969. He served as the president of student council, but also in 1970. And in 1970, he decided to write a document entitled A Dream Deferred, in which he basically traced everything that was happening everything that happened at the University of Virginia from 1967 until 1970. And I love this document because he signs it Jeffersoningly yours. And in a lot of ways, I've been trying to figure out what that means, but it's been so important to my research and really to my approach because, yes, I study the history of racial justice, and so much of that work at the University of Virginia has also been about critique, and it's about, how do we engage Jefferson? But for me, I'm not interested in just what my opinion is, but I'm interested in also understanding why Arthur Bud Ogle decided to sign this Jeffersoningly yours. And also, how is he imagining Jefferson? And what I do know is that there is no understanding of Bud Ogle without understanding the importance of the Declaration of Independence. I just want to say a little bit about this document because it's so important. This sprawling document included, first of all, a preamble, a detailed discussion of students' political concerns and organizing efforts around racial equality. It also included various reports, proposals, memos, and letters from key university stakeholders. And it also included a discussion about how to engage the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson. It says, sharing the moral ambiguities of its founder, Mr. Jefferson, the university at once affirmed the Declaration of Independence and African American dependence, the aristocracy of intellect and the inferiority of Blacks, the combat of reason for truth, and the forcible separation of the races. Ogle had new hope, he said the decade, the 1960s, opened with, quote, new hope, a new president, and new leadership for the university. He was optimistic about the future. And it is also interesting to note that he signed the letter, a letter in which he quoted Eldridge Cleaver, Martin Luther King, and Frederick Douglass. And he signed it in the spirit of Mad Tom, Radical Democrat. And Radical Democrat was in lowercase letters. So I would love to hear all of your thoughts about what you think is going on. Few were more outspoken than Bud Ogle, and that is Bud Ogle right there. Once again, he had been actively involved in political protests 1968, 1969, and 1970. But most importantly, in drawing from the Declaration of Independence, and once again, as an African-American historian, the Declaration of Independence is something that I'm constantly wrestling with as a person who also studies African-American intellectual history. When you read David Walker's Appeal, when he provides a critique of slavery, he turns to the Declaration of Independence. When you read Martin Luther King, and he talks about the need for what he would call a living income and inalienable rights, and when he's talking about the problems of poverty, he raises this question: what does it mean to pursue happiness? And in a speech, he says, if a man does not have a living wage, he merely exists. The point is, to understand those folks, you got to understand the Declaration of Independence. And I think understand the Declaration of Independence, not just in terms of its content, but I would also argue in terms of the process by which it was written. The coming together of people in thinking through central questions. And so that document is a model of democratic writing for the students in 1969, 1968, 1969, 1970, but also if we go to 1987. Throughout the history of student protest at the University of Virginia, students have written documents in which they state their grievances, in which they also talk about their right to critique the institution. There's no understanding UVA, I think, even though I'm not an alum of UVA, I'm a proud alum of Temple University and Notre Dame, but really Temple University. But there's no understanding that without thinking about how they are reading also the Declaration of Independence. So when we get to 2007, and the students are writing an audacious faith report in response to things that are happening at the university. They refer to the audacious faith report, which was written in 1987, sort of detailing the African-American experience, but once again, a document. When we turn to the 1990s, and there are conversations and questions about the experiences of African-American workers at the university, low-wage workers, low-income workers, and the ways in which they are entreated by their employers or management, we see a document known as the Muddy Floor document. When we think about the living wage protest at the University of Virginia, and we know in 1969, students raised questions about the treatment of workers. 1970, in fact, they had a conversation about equality. What is equality? What is justice? What is economic justice? Living wage was discussed. And then when we fast forward to the 1990s, during the Clinton era, you see conversations, especially with welfare reform, about the meaning of work. How are poor people being treated, poor workers? You see an upsurge in living wage activity in 1996, 1997, 1998, led by people like the historian Nelson Lichtenstein. But then you also see the living wage strike, the living wage sit-in in 2006, interestingly enough, a year after Hurricane Katrina. But with that came a document, Keeping Our Promise Toward a Living Wage. Once again, just thinking about the role of democratic, or I should say the art of writing in terms of putting forth demands. Of course, we know 2015, the arrest of Martise Johnson, a national story, an international story. Students engage in protest. It bears noting that this occurs also during a moment of Black Lives Matter, where there's conversations around the relationship between African Americans and the police, out of that protest toward a better university. What I've tried to do in not just my recollections, not just in my teaching, but also in the art that I create, is pay tribute to and engage this tradition of demands and political writing. And so what I'm going to show you now is a clip from a film that we did in 2016, Kevin Everson and I, entitled We Demand. And in 1970, students had a referendum. They put forth a series of demands. They voted. And what we wanted to do was sort of recreate this moment. A lot of my art is about recreation, and a lot of my art is about people engaging in democratic world making. And I'll just show you a little bit of this. This is Ricky Goldman. A lot of our work, we have our students participate in the work, in the recreation. And this film is called We Demand. It played at the Berlin International Film Festival. It played in some other places as well. And hopefully we can hear it. Let's see. Uh-oh.
Has complained to immediately revoke the injunction. Number 2, we demand that the university president, Edgar Shannon, prohibit university police from carrying firearms, and the university not allow any outside enforcement officials on its property. FBI, CIA, National Guard, Virginia State Police, Charlottesville, Albemarle County Police, etc. Number 3, we demand that President Shannon convene a general meeting of the entire university faculty in order to commence proceedings to remove complete the presence of ROTC, Navy, Marine, and Air Force from the grounds. Number 4, we demand that President Shannon immediately initiate action to sever any contractual obligations presently maintained with the Judge Advocate General Court. Number 5, we demand that the university terminate all research sponsored by or related to the Department of Defense, and that no classified research be countenanced any longer.
Yeah, so,
President Shannon does not look happy.
huh?
He doesn't look happy.
He doesn't, right? Oh, I should have had a better picture. But he is, they're demanding. Shannon is so important, of course, became the president in 1959. From 1959 to 1974, so important in terms of the globalization of the university, the modernization of the university, along with people like, it's going back as aldermen. One of the things that I also try to do in my class is not just have a conversation about student activism and how students engage in the art of political writing, but also how students engage in conversations about equality and what constitutes equality. And if nothing else, I think what a lot of my students have learned in the past year is that equality is a very contested term, especially when we think about educational inequality and the kind of university that we want. And so throughout the class, we talk about also the history of African Americans at the university. We know that the first African American applied to the University of Virginia actually in 1935, and that was Alice Jackson. Sometimes people forget about Alice Jackson. Alice Jackson was graduate of Virginia Union University, a university that produced a lot of prominent Black social scientists, people like Charles Johnson, people like Abram Harris, an economist, and her application was rejected because she was a woman, but also because she was an African American. Fast forward 15 years, and Gregory Swanson applied to the university. Gregory Swanson, a lot of times we say first African American admitted into the university. Fast forward 3 years, and of course, Walter Ridley receives his PhD from the University of Virginia, the first African American to actually receive a PhD from a Southern university.
In education.
In education. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. In education. That's right. And thank you for saying that, because the College of Arts and Sciences and the story of integration was slower, especially among undergraduates. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Also, people like James Gay. James Gay was from Norfolk, Virginia, 757. Went to Booker T. Washington High School, actively involved in the civil rights movement, participated in the sit-ins in 1960, was a proud graduate of Norfolk State University. And if you've been to Norfolk, you know, like, Booker T. Washington and Norfolk State are like right by each other. Applied to UVA Law, was accepted into UVA Law, became the first African American on student council, and played a critical role in pushing student council to address racial injustice and racial inequality. So much so that he had a feature in the Norfolk Journal and Guide, the Norfolk Journal and Guide. And when we think about political protests, Black newspapers are so important. In fact, next year we will be celebrating the 200th anniversary of Black newspapers. Freedom Journal was formed in 1827. And so a lot of and there are not a lot of course, there's not a lot of local newspapers still around, but a lot of the local newspapers that are still around that can go back to the 19th century or the early 20th century are participating in this celebration. And Norfolk Journal and Guide, which is not 200 years, but they are a part of this as well. But James Gay gets to the University of Virginia and is very active. Another important person is John Merchant. John Merchant was the first African American to graduate from the law school. And he was also a graduate of Virginia Union. His mentor was the theologian who basically advised Dr. King. And he was like, you're gonna go to the University of Virginia because the University of Virginia's first graduate is gonna be a Union man. And so John Merchant came to the University of Virginia, but really struggled in a lot of ways, but did well, but talked about what it meant and what it meant to struggle as a trailblazer. Another important trailblazer is Elaine Jones, critical figure in American legal history, was over the Legal Education Defense Fund. She graduated from UVA in 1970. She came here in 1967. Her sister, Gwendolyn Jones, would also graduate from the University of Virginia. And I love her quote. She said, they took a chance on me, so I took a chance on them. Because also it's important to understand that these African Americans didn't come here as cultural and political blank sheets. They came with their own traditions, etc. And so she's a part of a pioneering, trailblazing group of students, as is James Roebuck. I sort of claim him because he got his PhD in history at the University of Virginia. And these are folks who were attempting to transform the university. They were motivated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we've been having a lot of conversations about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and questions around compliance. It bears noting that it was not until 1982 that the state of Virginia's civil rights and desegregation plan was actually accepted by the Office of Civil Rights. So one of the things that we do in my course is really explore the complex history of civil rights. at the University of Virginia, but also in the state of Virginia. These were some of the demands, and we sort of talked about the demands from 1969. Black American Black Law Students Association, BALSA, created in 1970. So African American students get here too, and they begin to build institutions. Black fraternity life, Black sorority life. There also is emerging these questions around what should racial integration look like? And what role does the federal government and the state play in shaping racial integration at Virginia universities and colleges? In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. The Title VI is a part of the Civil Rights Act, and it authorized HEW to oversee the integration process. It bears noting, however, it was not until 1969 and 1970 that the Health, Education, and Welfare Department even began to study dual education in the South and examine it. And so throughout the 1970s, there emerged these debates about the pace and the process of integration in Virginia. Virginia's governor felt as if, Godwin felt as if, Mills, that the University of Virginia and the state of Virginia was progressing well. And so there emerged these intense battles between the Office of Civil Rights and also the Virginia governor. Things became a little more complicated in the mid-1970s around, of course, the issue of Farmington. In 1974, Cavalier Daily ran an editorial in which they discussed the fact that Farmington Country Club still had an exclusionary policy with regards to the admissions of African Americans, racial minorities, including Jews. This resulted in a series of protests from 1974 to 1976. I should note Larry Sabato, for example, who was student council president in '74, talked about these issues. This is actually Leroy Hassell, who has since passed, but was a Supreme Court justice. And actually, he followed the first African-American Supreme Court justice in Virginia, let me be more specific, John Charles Thomas, who was a graduate of the University of Virginia, a double who, I can never say that right, double who received his BA and his law degree. And so this was like the students engaging in protest, and of course that is Frank Hereford, largely because it was revealed that this was 144 UVA members, 17 department chairs, 7 deans, 3 members of the athletic department, and 8 members of the board of visitor in 1974 belonged to Farmington Country Club. In 1967, Edgar Shannon resigned from Farmington. One of the things that we do in our class, first of all, and this is getting back to the Declaration of Independence, but thinking about democracy, in the civil rights, they used to sing the song, we who believe in freedom will not rest, but freedom is a constant struggle. And so one of the reasons I like to focus on this, and let me say this, there were a lot of intellectual debates around this. Some people argued that as an American, you have this right, freedom of association. Now, some folks said, well, if you're asking me to go and do recruiting in certain communities, it's hard to do that when we have these numbers. But this was Farmington, and once again, it evoked conversations about what this equality, what this integration truly looked like. 1980s, the African American presence. In the 1980s, the Black student population reaches 1,000 for the first time. Now I'm gonna tell you this about the University of Virginia. Comparatively speaking, I just said that the Civil Rights Office didn't accept the university or the state's desegregation plan until 1982. That's because desegregation or a plan was based on how you did at the state level. It wasn't just individually. But in a lot of ways, the University of Virginia made a lot of progress. The undergraduate Black student population was not 50 in 1969. I always say this because when you think about that protest in 1969, and there are 1,500 students, 1,200 students, 1,000 students engaging in protests, calling for an African American studies program because they say, you know what? The study of African American and African history and culture and literature is central and important to a great liberal arts education. It's not 1,000 Black folk at UVA at that time. See, what I did was problematic. Yeah, there were. They worked here. So let me, see, I have to watch myself with that as well. But basically, not a lot of African Americans. They start coming in mass, or mass, in 1970. In 1976, the Black student population reaches 500 for the first time. In the 1980s, it reaches 1,000. Still conversations around diversity, equity, educational opportunity, equity as opportunity, equity as outcome. These are just some enrollment trends because questions around, the African American presence will be central in the 1980s as students are talking about a lot of other things, international politics, national politics, South Africa and apartheid. All of these things are important. UVA in the 1990s. This is considered by many African Americans the golden age of what they call sometimes Black UVA. In the 1990s, African American student population peaks. They're building on old traditions. They're building on things that they created in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, but they're also building on new traditions. Also, they're confronting the reality of diversity within diversity. In 1970s, most people who would be classified as Black came from Washington, D.C. and Norfolk, Virginia and Atlanta, Georgia and Houston, Texas. Those who are classified as Black in the 1990s now are coming from all parts of the world. They're sometimes the first and second generation immigrants as well. Now they might be coming from the DMV, but that globalization. Also, it's important to note, in 1999 or in 2000, Asian Americans become the largest minority at the University of Virginia. All of this results too in conversations about diversity. This is one of the things that I am interested in and fascinated in, is also the long history of diversity. Now, contrary to opinion, diversity did not start with Jim Ryan. The diversity office actually, if we think about how we think about the diversity office in a modern moment, can be traced in many ways to the alleged assault of Daisy Lundy in 2003, which resulted in, of course, John Castine. And there's no story about diversity, equity, and inclusion at UVA without John Castine. It's an important part of this story. This is his statement in response to this story, but also it results in the appointment of William Harvey as the diversity chief. And so one of the things that we do, and once again, to me, when I think about the Declaration of Independence, it always invites conversations about what does liberty mean? What does equality mean? What does equal mean? All men are created equal before God, right? And as a person who identifies of a certain faith, I know I think about that in sort of all people are created before God in sort of religious terms. Are like, what's all people? Who constitutes people, right? Sometimes that can be contested, but thinking about these words, how do we think about diversity? And so to me, one of the interesting things of the past 22 years is how the university has wrestled with this question of diversity and defined diversity. Do we think about it in racial terms? How do we think about it in terms of economics? So also think about John Castine and questions around college affordability and access UVA. Definition belongs to the definers, not the defined. Toni Morrison. This is in 2007, 2008. Students here are thinking about diversity, but thinking about also a holistic understanding. Discursively, diversity has been broadly defined. However, in relation to Black students, the most substantive and successful endeavors have been limited to the recruitment and retention of Black undergraduate students. So here, students are raising questions about diversity as it relates to the experiences of workers, but also faculty diversity. Those conversations become more complex, deeper, as we move into Black Lives Matter. Also conversations around and thinking about Jefferson, thinking about the Declaration of Independence, but also thinking about the legacy of slavery. Fast forward, Charlottesville 2017, the meaning of Jefferson, the meaning of declaration, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, the contestation, the debates about even evoking the Declaration of Independence and evoking Jefferson. You know, for me, that's not a question and that's not a debate. Once again, if I start at the very beginning, to understand African-American intellectual history, I have to engage Jefferson and I have to engage the Declaration of Independence. I gotta think about what they were thinking about when they wrote it, but also how other people were thinking about it and thinking through it. Just wanting to kind of capture the journey. I want to now, and I feel like I've been in dialogue with you all, and so this is how I've been approaching and thinking about student activism, the past, the present, and the future of the university, and also how celebrating and thinking about the Declaration of Independence provides us with the opportunity to think about the role of the university in advancing not just the public good, but also creating a more robust democracy. And so I'm gonna kind of stop there because I have actually just been talking. I have no idea of how long I can talk, but I've been going. I feel like I've been going for a long time, but I actually wanna hear from you all. I would love your thoughts on Jeffersoningly yours. That would help me so much because my students have been useless in that. No, I'm just joking. Radical Tom, Cat, but yeah, I appreciate the conversation. Yes.
So my daddy's Paul Gaston, so.
I know.
Grew up here. So every visitor that came, we went up to Monticello.
Uh-huh.
I was still, what, 4 years old, 5
Mhm.
years old. So the story is eventually I says, Daddy, when are we gonna meet Mr. Jefferson?
Ah,
I didn't know
Sounds
he did.
just like your father.
Yeah.
yep, yeah.
Yes,
Looks like him too.
yeah.
Did you all hear that?
Yeah.
Repeat that.
Daddy, when are we gonna get to meet Mr. Jefferson? Because we came there so often and he was just.
Who is his name?
His dad is Paul
Paul
Gaston.
Gaston.
And Paul Gaston was a professor of history, quote me if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he came here in 1957.
57 to 90.
Okay, I'll be on it. Don't mess it up, no, just joking. He came there in 1957, really Southern historian, African-American historian, marching with with those students, integration, desegregation of Buddy's restaurant, he was a part of that. Was important in terms of, first African-American Studies class was offered in 1969, played a critical role in demanding Black Studies, played a critical role in bringing Armstead Robinson to the University of Virginia. Armstead got his BA from Yale University, edited as an undergrad a volume called Black Studies and the University, which of course was founded and funded by Ford. And just an important, Professor Gaston was an important person. And I will say this, I remember when I started doing this research and I really, so let me just say this is not actually my area, it was not my initial area of expertise. I did African-American history in the 1920s, but I would notice when I mentioned something local, the students would like really pay attention. Because really, this is some of the most self-centered stuff you can do. I mean, it's Black Fire is a class at UVA about students, for students. It's just so self-centered. But I just noticed they got very interested. And so over time, I just started adding more and more. And I remember when I would find stuff, I would talk to Paul. And I remember one time we were talking, and it was at his house. And he said, it wasn't like I wish I had done more, but a lot of times as we all get older, one of the things that we don't do enough is engage in critical reflection and kind of think about things where sometimes I say, man, I really messed up in 2016. I got mad at those students and I said, I'm not gonna be your faculty advisor anymore because you don't listen. And now I look back over it, it was a mistake. And sometimes we are not honest about the mistakes that we made. And I always appreciate it. It wasn't anything specific, but it was just sometimes I think as we get older, we can also be hard on young people. And we are not always honest about our own shortcomings. And there was just a level of honesty and openness that I appreciated. So, yeah. Yes.
So I'm a Northerner, and I would love to hear how a university that I assume was populated by Southern aristocrats, the sons of Southern aristocrats, turned this way to actually demand Black studies and racial justice. How did these kids ever get there?
That's a great question. I think there are two things, and I think Gaston's work helps us do this. The South was also not a monolith, and there were different political traditions within the South. There existed within the South, and there's a great book by Jeffrey Turner called Sitting In, Sitting Out, that sort of talks about there was a progressive community, or what we might call progressive students. And by 1966, and actually Gaston talks about this, they are surfacing. These are students who have been fundamentally transformed, unmoored, spiritually awakened by the civil rights movement. There is something that, even when I teach, there's something that happens when, somebody sits on a bus on, December the 1st and doesn't get up. And by December 5th, they're doing a boycott and nobody gets on the bus. In some ways, it's almost like you can only describe it in spiritual terms. There are a group of students who are watching this. They've seen their peers in Richmond and Greensboro and Birmingham make sacrifices. They've heard about Cheney and Schwerner in Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi. And so I think there's a group of students, and it's not always the majority, but it's a group and they're vocal. So there's a small group. There's also a changing demographic of the university. It is also occurring at the time in which the university is trying to become more modern. They're trying to become top, they're becoming, right? And so there's also a group of students who are coming from the north. And then there's like these little trailblazers, these African Americans who are coming by the ones and the twos, who know the experience of being the only one in their class. They're coming. So I think about this idea, what Snick used to say, come let us build a world together. I think there is a critical mass of people who are here by 65, 66, who are willing to engage in this democratic experiment. And this is the thing I have to do more work on. I'm interested in how for some of them, how certain traditions, the Jeffersonian Declaration, are helping them piece this together and think about it. That's what's important for me. Not the only thing, but that is what I'm teasing through now. Yes.
I wonder also, looking back at that time, activism wasn't just about civil rights, it was also about the Vietnam War. That whole generation all of a sudden was forced into things they didn't want to do. And I'm wondering about UVA. I'm sure that there were protests both about civil rights and about the war. And which one dominated, or did they mesh somehow?
Yes, thank you so much. And this is a great question. I think they're intricately connected. That first picture that I showed, one of my favorite pictures. Come on, why did I put all these slides? That is actually Vietnam. That is actually is doing the May Days. It's not Berkeley, it's not Columbia, it is the Coat and Tie Rebellion. 1969, but in 1970, the war in Kent State and all of these things are coming together. Jerry Rubin and Bill Kushner happened to be on grounds during Kent State. So they give a talk at U Hall, and there's thousands of students that are there. And so no, you're absolutely right. I think it has to be understood within the context of the war. But like people like Roebuck will tell, he told me when I interviewed him, he was like in 65, 66, he wasn't there in terms of being against the war. It was a process. In fact, I think a lot of student activists will call Roebuck sort of moderate. And and I think you can get a sense of that from a lot of things that have been written. I think John Thomas's memoir is important. Joel Gardner, Yale Rebel Rail is another important piece. So I've relied on all of these to kind of get a sense. But and sometimes people have different perspectives on what they did in the 60s and the 70s. So I also rely on the Cavalier Daily, but you're absolutely right. Anti-war protests, civil rights, also women's rights, the women's lib movement, extremely important if we turned our attention, say, to the law school. Because in the law school, you're talking about not just like Elaine Jones, but you're talking about Linda Gordon, who was the first African-American to be the president of the Law Council. And actually, she had a lot of conflict with some African-American male students who did not believe that a woman should be the one that was leading. So they had these really complex debates over even faculty hiring. Yeah.
We can take, I saw two, so can we do those two and then?
Okay, or I can do them all and try to quickly.
We'll
Okay.
do.
I think another factor was the social changes going on in the general population. The schools were being truly integrated rather than having the black school and the white school. And you could go to either one you want, but then I think it was 69, they truly combined together. And I think that had something to do with it.
It's definitely critical. And I think also it shapes the experiences of African Americans who came from predominantly black schools and then African Americans who experienced busing. Yes.
So I graduated from the law school in 1987.
Okay.
And the issue for the 3 years I was here, it didn't get resolved until later, after it was how the foundation was invested in white South African. So talk a little bit about that and tell me in a description, and I get the whole 60s and everybody was progressive in the 60s, but how did this university, I mean, the discussion at that time that I remember is pretty much what they talked about farming. I mean, we can do this, we can do what we want to with our money, we're making good money with it, it's a solid foundation, and that's the way that money's gonna stay. I mean, there was an arrogance to that whole response.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm gonna answer, I'm gonna try to get.
Enjoyed your presentation this evening.
Thank you.
You mentioned a number of HBCUs. Virginia Union, you mentioned probably Howard. Any other HBCUs
Virginia
that were feeder schools into UVA?
Union, Howard, Virginia State. There's no conversation about the peer advisor program, and UVA being known as not only having a high retention rate, but also graduation rate without the peer advisor. There's no conversation about the peer advisor program without Sylvia Terry. And there's no making of Sylvia Terry without Virginia State University. When she gets here, she says, there are certain things that we had at historically black colleges in terms of mentoring that we want to produce. You know, and so I think Virginia State is extremely important, but Union, Union is important. Howard, Elaine Jones went to Howard. If I was pushing for, I would say the HBCUs in Virginia, and I would also say Howard. Not as much. Hampton is the school they're thinking about going to rather than UVA. Hampton is so important in terms of sort of black intellectual prowess. Yeah. But that's what I would say. And I'm gonna stay with South Africa. Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about how the
and I'm gonna answer the South
you
Africa.
talked about how in admissions the number of minorities increased in the 90s. Yeah? And you just mentioned Sylvia Terry. Okay, so I just want to share that my brother was the director of minority recruitment during that period and worked with Sylvia Terry. His name is Mike Allen.
Oh my God.
Your brother is a legend. I need to interview. We keep your brother a legend.
Yeah, so that's when the numbers increased, and he was really good friends with Dr. Ridley. I met Dr. Ridley back in the 90s, and my brother Mike and him spent a lot of time together. Sylvia and Terry, you know, it was a bunch of them working together to recruit more minorities. So I just had to give a shout out.
Yeah, no. Absolute a legend.
You mentioned that the early 1990s was sort of the high watermark of black enrollment at UVA. Kind of curious to know where we are now.
We're now in 1990, we was 1990s around 13% thanks to certain people. I went to Temple in the 90s. Temple was 25% African American. It's around 12% now. You know, so what you've seen, and I think this is related to college affordability, I think it's related to a lot of things. There's actually been at a lot of state schools a dip. So in 2012, the aggregate number of African Americans undergrads dipped below 1,000 for the first time in more than a decade. And so the 90s are the peak periods, and then we start seeing a decline. Now, you know, there are different racial classifications and others, and you know, but even if you do that, there has definitely been a decline. That's why the 80s and the 90s are considered kind of this peak moment. Also interesting, getting back to this question of South Africa, I have a document from the Black Student Alliance in 1979, where they're raising questions about South Africa and investment in South Africa. Of course, we know 1984, 1985, that's when you get Thanksgiving 1984, Eleanor Eleanor Holmes Norton and all of those folks began to engage in protests over South Africa, you get almost a year of protests at the South African Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. There are protests across the country. It begins to catch on 85, 86. You have the shanties, you have protests out. There's a whole policy about student protest that emerges as a result. There's the lawsuit during that period. And you're right, it is a critical issue, but you don't really begin to see the traction until like the early 1990s. But it is an important moment in terms of protest. But also in terms of establishing rules around student governance and student protest.
Oh, no, it's totally fine. I appreciate all of the questions and comments. One thing just before we leave, if you go down the stairs, you will see the front door has the automatic door. There's also doors to the sides of the hallways that'll get you outside to the parking lot. If anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about Charlottesville in the 1970s, I will be hosting a gallery tour tomorrow at 12 p.m. We have an exhibit at Vault, Virginia, which is on the downtown mall in the old People's National Bank, big bank building. That exhibit is called Then and Now, Charlottesville in the 1970s. The picture of James Roebuck reading the demands with Edgar Shannon kind of looming behind him is in that exhibit from the Daily Progress. But we have looked at the 1970s as a whole, including the construction of the downtown mall and how that affected the city and the city's history. So if anyone is interested in taking that gallery tour, I will be leading that at 12 o'clock tomorrow at the gallery. I hope some of you will choose to come. Information is available also on our website. We can take it a little past and talk about the city outside of UVA a little bit tomorrow if you're interested in joining. Thank you again so much. If you haven't signed up for our e-newsletter, please feel free to leave your email address, and we will have information coming soon about the final presentation in this program series, but then we'll be on to the next more and exciting programs after that as well. Thank you all so much.